until I pulled into my driveway. I left all my gear in the car and ran straight into the house, collapsing on the couch as the sun started to rise. Even now, I have no clue what I came across out there, but I'll never go back into those woods again. I believe something dangerous is hiding there, waiting for the next hiker to make the mistake of walking that path alone. I was 18 when this happened. There was a bright full moon casting an eerie light over the thick forest as I hiked with two friends, Tom and Sarah. The evening began beautifully, a perfect autumn night, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, the woods took on a darker, more menacing feel. Before long, we all sensed something was wrong. Trying to lighten the mood, I told them, "Come on, don't be scared. It's just darkness and maybe a few howling wolves. What could happen?" Tom, always the risk taker, had suggested the night hike, promising it would be unforgettable. But as the shadows stretched longer and the trees seemed to close in on us, even I began to regret agreeing. Sarah, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since we entered the forest, finally spoke up. "Danny, I don't know about this. It's way too quiet. I've heard stories about weird things happening here on full moons." I had heard those stories too. Tales of missing pets, strange figures seen between the trees. I had always dismissed them as superstitions. But as we continued further into the woods, a strange chill crept up my spine. Sarah, clearly nervous, clutched Tom's arm. "It's just your imagination," he said, trying to comfort her. "Besides, Danny's got our backs, right?" I forced a grin. "Yeah, don't worry, I've got this." We kept walking, the only sounds being the crunch of leaves under our boots and the occasional distant owl. Moonlight pierced through the branches, casting creepy shadows across the forest floor. It was impossible to shake the feeling we weren't alone. Eventually, we stumbled upon a hidden trail, overgrown with branches and thick brush. Tom's eyes lit up. "Look at this. This could be a shortcut back to the car," he exclaimed. Sarah and I exchanged worried glances but followed as Tom cleared the way with a small knife. As we ventured down the overgrown path, the forest seemed to close in tighter around us. The trees blocked out the moon and stars, and the air felt colder, carrying a strange, musty smell. "Tom, are you sure this is a good idea?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Tom hesitated, then shrugged. "We've already come this far. Let's see where it goes." Reluctantly, we pressed on, but the farther we walked, the more I regretted it. Strange scratches appeared on the tree trunks, deep and fresh. I pointed them out. "Probably just bears," Tom muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. "Are there even bears here?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. "I think so," I replied, trying to reassure her, though I wasn't sure myself. The trail seemed endless, and the eerie silence weighed heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching us. Eventually, we came to a small clearing, where an old, crumbling cabin stood in the center. The roof was partially collapsed, and the windows were broken, giving the place a haunted look. "Why would anyone build a cabin out here?" Sarah asked, voice shaking. I had no answer for her. The whole situation felt surreal, like we had walked into a nightmare. But Tom, ever the explorer, couldn't resist. "Let's check it out," he said with a grin, already heading for the door. The door creaked loudly as we entered. Inside, the cabin was empty, save for a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. It looked like no one had been there for years, but something caught my eye. More of those strange scratches, this time etched into the wooden walls. "Guys, look at this," I whispered. Tom came over to examine them. "These don't look like animal scratches," he said, a shiver in his voice. "They look human." Fear gnawed at my stomach. "We need to leave. Now." Just as I said that, a low growl echoed from outside the cabin. We all froze, hearts pounding. What was that? Sarah whispered, pale as a ghost. I don't know, but it didn't sound like an animal. I whispered back, trying to stay calm. Tom cautiously moved to the door and peered out. I don't see anything, but we should go. The growl came again, this time louder, more threatening. We rushed outside, and as we moved away from the cabin, the growling followed, growing more menacing with every step. My heart raced, felt like something was hunting us. Suddenly, a dark shape lunged out of the bushes. It was massive, with matted fur and glowing eyes. My mind raced as I stared at the creature, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It looked like something straight out of a nightmare, a werewolf. Tom screamed, "Run!" snapping me out of my daze. We sprinted down the trail, the creature chasing close behind, its snarls echoing in the night. My lungs burned as we ran, the forest a blur around us. I could feel the beast gaining on us, its heavy footsteps pounding the ground. I risked a glance back. Its yellow eyes were locked on mine, and its snarling mouth dripped with saliva. Panic surged through me. Just as I thought it would catch us, we broke free from the hidden trail, back onto the main path. The growling stopped, but the creature let out a howl of frustration. For some reason, it had stopped chasing us, as if it couldn't leave that strange trail. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. Breathless and trembling, we finally allowed ourselves to laugh, though it was more out of relief than humor. As we sped away from those woods, I couldn't stop thinking about the glowing eyes and the legends I had once brushed off as mere stories. I never told anyone about that night, but it haunts me still. Could it have left the path? Was it alone? Maybe it was cursed to wander the forest during the full moon. I dread the thought that it might have been part of something larger. I may never know the answers, but one thing's for sure. I'm staying away from those woods for good, especially on nights when the moon is full. Growing up in a rural part of Colorado, I spent countless hours outdoors, exploring the woods and canyons around my family's big property. By the time I was 12, I knew those woods like the back of my hand. That familiarity gave me a sense of freedom, but also made me a little careless. Looking back, I was far too comfortable being out there alone. I thought nothing could hurt me. How wrong I was. It all began the summer before 7th grade. With school out, I had plenty of unsupervised time while my parents were at work. I quickly got bored hanging around the house. My grandparents lived about 2 miles away through the woods, so I decided to start hiking over there in the afternoons to change things up and to raid their pantry. The first few times I made the trek were uneventful. Their home backed up right to the forest, so I would emerge from the trees into their yard. My grandma always seemed so happy to see me, bustling around to make me a snack while I watched TV. It became a nice little routine. The walk there and back was peaceful, just me and nature. But toward the end of June, things began to feel different. I noticed that the usual sounds of birds and small animals seemed to have quieted. The woods felt darker somehow. I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just a storm coming in. I should have turned back right then. I was about halfway to my grandparents' house when the rain started falling. I pulled my hood up and kept going. Then, a loud clap of thunder shook the air, much closer than I expected. The wind picked up, thrashing the branches around. Even though it was the middle of the afternoon, the sky turned an eerie green-gray. I started to walk faster, hoping to beat the storm. But soon, the sky opened up, and the rain poured down in heavy sheets. The ground turned muddy, and I was soaked, cold, and miserable. Still, I kept moving toward the safety of my grandparents' house. Out of nowhere, a chilling screech pierced the air, unlike any sound I had ever heard from the animals around here. I froze, straining to see through the downpour. Between the trees, a flickering light appeared, moving erratically, like someone carrying a lantern. Was my grandpa coming to look for me? I called out, but there was no answer. The light kept moving toward me, bobbing up and down, much lower than my tall grandpa would be if he were holding a light. A second screech, louder this time, sent a shiver down my spine. The light continued to approach. My heart raced. I turned and ran deeper into the woods, not caring that I was heading into unfamiliar territory. I just needed to get away. Mud splashed up as I stumbled through the forest, branches scratching my arms. A flash of lightning struck a nearby tree, the crack ringing in my ears. The sharp smell of burning wood filled the air as rain sizzled on the smoldering bark. But I didn't stop. I ran through the darkness, slipping and falling, feeling blood in my mouth as I hit the ground. The light was closer now, weaving through the trees. I scrambled to my feet and kept running, just as another bolt of lightning struck behind me, pushing me forward. I didn't stop until I thought my lungs would burst. Finally, I stumbled into a small clearing where an old, abandoned cabin stood against the rocky hillside. I threw myself against the door, slamming it shut just as another wail echoed from the tree line. Shaking, I sank to the floor, heart pounding. Whatever it was out there kept screaming, a mix of anger and pain that made my skin crawl. I must have passed out from exhaustion because the next thing I remember is waking up in complete darkness. The storm had calmed to a light drizzle. The cabin was silent, and whatever had been out there seemed to be gone. Dazed and confused, I cautiously stepped outside. The moon had broken through the clouds, casting just enough light to help me navigate through the trees. With arms stretched out, I carefully made my way through the woods, walking for hours in fear that the thing was still nearby. By some miracle, I stumbled out of the forest as dawn broke, collapsing onto my back porch. I rushed inside, locking the door behind me and sinking to the floor in relief. My parents never found out what happened that day. Either way, the experience left me with a lasting fear of trails and woods that close in on me unless I'm walking right next to someone. Whatever took me to that strange place when I got lost, it's a nightmare I can't fully wake up from, always feeling that unsettling presence lurking behind me in the shadows. My unusual experience comes from Max. This took place a couple of years ago on a warm late summer evening. I was 17, riding my small 150 cubic centimeters motorcycle through a quiet village. I just needed to clear my mind since I was going through a rough patch, and the sound of the engine always helped me relax. Most of the ride was peaceful and calm, exactly what I was looking for. I was heading down a dead-end road that led to some ponds, intending to turn around and head back. About halfway down the road, I saw someone dressed completely in white, walking along. Normally, this wouldn't be unusual, as many people take walks here, but this felt different. It was 11 p.m., pitch dark, and the person had no lights or reflectors on them. The area was also deserted, with no houses along the 2-kilometer stretch. That I slowed down instinctively, as pedestrians can be unpredictable, but that turned out to be a mistake. Just as I was halfway past the person, they let out the most terrifying scream I'd ever heard. My heart raced, and before I could process what was happening, they charged at me. I panicked, fumbling to shift into the lowest gear as fast as I could. I glanced in my mirror and saw the person still coming after me as I twisted the throttle wide open. For those who don't know, a 150 cubic centimeters bike isn't very fast, and my acceleration wasn't great, barely faster than a running person. To make matters worse, I had modified the bike with a larger front sprocket to save fuel, which slowed the initial speed. I kept the throttle wide open, nearing 9,000 RPM, getting ready to shift gears when I felt a hand smack the back of my bike. I was terrified and over-revved the engine up to 13,000 RPM, not wanting to shift while the person was so close. They kept up with me until I hit around 30 kilometers per hour, and only then did I start to pull away from them. I didn't slow down even after losing sight of the person. It was only when I remembered that the road dead-ended in the woods that fresh panic set in. As I neared the end, I recalled there was a small gravel trail meant for hikers. My bike was old, with a regular light switch, unlike modern bikes that have automatic lights when running. On instinct, I turned off my headlights and shifted into fifth gear, trying to make as little noise as possible while following the gravel path back to the main road. Once I was back on the main road, I continued speeding, constantly checking behind me. When I finally made it home, I was trembling, drenched in sweat. I hurried to park my bike in the garage, still glancing around, then ran inside, slamming the door shut and locking it for good measure. The next day, I called a friend and told him what had happened, asking him to come with me back to the area. We hiked through the forest that ran alongside the road, looking for any signs that someone had set up a prank, but we found nothing. The only tracks in the dirt were mine and my friends. That I'm not usually one to get scared easily, and I'm a pretty big guy, about 190 centimeters tall with a muscular build. But that scream, I'll never forget it. It wasn't something a normal person could make. Even thinking about it now sends shivers down my spine. I've shared this story with a few friends, and they all took me seriously since I'm not one to make up things or get easily rattled. This was by far the scariest moment I've had while riding my 150 cubic centimeters at night. Looking back, I feel like I might have been able to fend off the person, especially since I was wearing full motorcycle gear, but when I heard that scream, all I could think of was running. It was so loud and inhuman. I've avoided that road ever since and have no intention of going back. I still don't know what that person was doing there, in the middle of the night, dressed in all white without any lights in the middle of nowhere. There are no hospitals or mental health facilities nearby, so I doubt it was an escaped patient, but I can't come up with any rational explanation. Thanks for listening to my story here at Camping Horrors. In the summer of 2020, after finishing my last year of college, I wanted to do something exciting before starting my new job. I decided to take a solo backpacking trip in the Green Mountain region for a week. I've always been an experienced hiker and camper, having grown up near the Adirondacks, so I didn't feel nervous about being out there alone. The first few days of the trip went smoothly. The weather was perfect, sunny but not too hot, and I hiked about 8 to 10 miles daily, enjoying the beautiful views. I ran into a few other hikers and campers along the way, but for the most part, I was by myself. By the third day, things started to feel off. The birds and animals seemed quieter than before, and the few hikers I passed didn't smile or greet me like usual. They looked worried and were eager to leave. I figured this was because I had ventured deeper into the backcountry, but it still left me feeling a little uneasy. That night, I set up my camp by a small creek. I built a fire, but the night stayed so warm that I didn't really need it. I left the tent flap open to let in the fresh air. As I started to doze off, I thought I heard footsteps in the leaves nearby. I sat up and listened but didn't hear anything unusual, just the usual nighttime forest sounds. Even so, it took a while for me to fall asleep. The next morning, I hiked up and out of the valley I had camped in, climbing steeper and rockier terrain. The forest felt dense, and I had the eerie feeling that something was watching me, though I couldn't see anyone. I told myself it was just my nerves from being alone for so long. As evening came, I set up camp on a ridge with a great view of the surrounding mountains. After making dinner and cleaning up, I settled into my tent. The full moon lit up the tent, casting strange shadows inside. Exhausted, I drifted off to sleep. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night to my tent shaking violently. The poles bent and collapsed on top of me, and I panicked, thinking a bear was attacking. I scrambled out of the tent, but when I got outside, there was nothing there. The tent was damaged, but no tears or claw marks were on the fabric. The night was calm and bathed in moonlight. Confused and a little scared, I fixed the tent as best I could and tried to sleep again. The next morning, I packed up quickly, eager to leave the ridge. The weather had changed overnight, and a cold wind was blowing as I headed downhill. Dark clouds began rolling in, and thunder rumbled in the distance. I hurried, trying to reach the next shelter before the storm hit. I arrived just as the rain started pouring down. Relieved, I entered the shelter, but that relief quickly vanished when I saw the inside. There were dirty rags strewn about, claw marks on the walls, and the fire pit was filled with charred bones that smelled like burnt flesh. My heart raced, and I backed out of the shelter, terrified. Then I saw something, a large, shadowy figure moving through the woods toward me. I didn't think. I just ran, sprinting into the storm as lightning flashed and thunder crashed overhead. I slipped on the muddy trail but kept going, crashing through the woods as something chased me. I finally reached a rocky clearing just as lightning struck nearby, the loud crack shaking me to my core. I turned to look back, but the forest was still and silent. The thing, whatever it was gone. Shaken, I found a small cave in the rocks where I sheltered from the rain. I stayed there until the storm passed, too scared to move. When I finally emerged, it was getting dark, and I knew I had to find a safe place to camp. Every sound in the forest made me jump, and I felt like I was being watched again. As the sun set, I picked up my pace, running down the trail. Suddenly, I ran into something solid but soft. I looked up and saw a pale, grotesque face with hollow black eyes and jagged teeth. It loomed over me, and I screamed, trying to run. But its hands grabbed my shoulders, and I felt claws digging into my skin. The creature opened its mouth wide as if to swallow me whole, and everything went black. I must have passed out because when I woke up, I was alone on the trail. Whatever had attacked me was gone. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed my gear, and ran down the mountain as fast as I could, twigs snapping behind me as I fled. I didn't stop until I reached the parking lot, where I threw my things into the car, started the engine, and drove off, not stopping until I was miles away. Even now, I can still hear the screams that echoed through the trees as I sped away. I don't know what that thing was or if it was real, but I'll never forget that night. The drive home was especially quiet. He's 19 now, but hasn't been camping since that experience. To be honest, it took me years to feel comfortable going camping again. What was once a peaceful retreat in the wilderness now feels filled with hidden dangers. You just never know who or what could show up at your tent next time. Because of what happened, I don't hike alone anymore. The memory still gives me chills. I often wonder how close I came to some unknown danger out there. Back then, I was dating a guy named Chris. We had been together for about half a year and liked doing outdoorsy things. Hiking, kayaking, stuff like that. One Saturday, we decided to visit a state park we hadn't been to before, about an hour's drive from town. We got a late start that morning and didn't reach the park until nearly noon. It was a beautiful day. We stopped by the small ranger station to pick up a trail map. The ranger recommended a nice 6-mile loop that led to a waterfall overlook. Chris and I geared up with our hiking boots and water packs, then set off down the trail. At first, the trail was wide and easy to follow, well marked with signs. We were enjoying the scenery and talking, just having a good time. As the trail gradually climbed uphill, we came to a fork in the path that wasn't on the map. We weren't sure which way to go. Chris figured we should go left because we could hear the faint sound of rushing water that way, which we assumed was the waterfall. As we followed the path, it became narrower and less maintained, with thick vegetation closing in on both sides. After about 20 minutes, I started feeling uneasy and told Chris I thought we were going the wrong way. He shrugged it off, saying, "It's probably just a little farther." He was convinced we'd find something cool if not the waterfall. Suddenly, the forest grew denser, and after pushing through thick trees for several minutes, I stepped into a clearing and realized Chris was gone. I called his name, but there was no answer. How could he have disappeared so fast? He had been right behind me moments earlier. I retraced my steps, growing more anxious as there was no trace of him. The trail forked again ahead, but neither direction looked familiar. I called out for Chris again, but all I got in return was silence. I had no idea which way to go. I picked a path randomly, hoping it would lead me back to the main trail, but after walking for several more minutes, nothing looked recognizable. That's when the fear really set in. I was lost. The sun was getting lower, casting long shadows through the trees. I started walking faster, hoping to find some kind of trail marker or something familiar. My heart pounded, and the forest around me seemed to get darker with each step. I could have sworn I heard footsteps behind me at one point, but when I stopped to listen, the sound vanished. Out of breath and low on water, I took a break on a fallen tree, trying not to cry. Just as I sat down, I heard a twig snap. My head jerked up, and I scanned the forest. About 100 feet away, I saw the outline of a tall man standing still among the trees. I called out, "Chris," but even as the words left my mouth, I knew it wasn't him. The figure was too tall, and something about him didn't seem right. Fear flooded through me. I grabbed the largest stick I could find and yelled, "Stay away from me!" But the man didn't move. He just stood there, blending into the shadows, watching me. I had no idea who he was or what he wanted, but I wasn't going to wait around to find out. I bolted, running as fast as I could through the trees, my heart racing. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but the man was gone. I didn't stop running until I burst into another small clearing. I was shaking, drenched in sweat, and completely lost. I knew I couldn't just wander around as it got darker. I needed a plan, but my mind was racing. Should I keep trying to find my way out or hunker down for the night? Then I heard it, the faint sound of traffic. A highway, maybe. If I could just follow that noise, it might lead me back to safety. I started moving quickly toward the sound, my heart pounding with every rustle in the bushes. Was that strange man still following me? The sounds of birds and animals seemed eerie in the growing darkness. I kept looking over my shoulder, but all I saw were trees. Finally, the noise of traffic got louder, and hope surged inside me. I was close to a road, but just as I thought I was in the clear, a figure stepped out from behind a tree, blocking my path only 30 feet ahead. I froze. It was him, the same tall man from before. This time, I could see his face clearly. It was horribly disfigured, with scars and burns covering most of it. His stringy hair hung over one cloudy eye, but his other eye was locked on me. "Were you going in such a hurry?" he rasped, his voice low and menacing. Panic overtook me. I gripped my stick tightly and swung it at him with all my strength, but he dodged and lunged toward me. I turned and ran as fast as I could, not stopping until I broke through the trees into a parking lot. There were cars, people. I was safe. I sprinted toward a family loading their vehicle, barely able to speak through my gasps for air. The father quickly got me into their car, and his son called the police. When the officers arrived, I told them what happened, but there was no sign of the man. Brian eventually made it back to the parking lot, just as freaked out as I was. We'd gotten separated on the trail, and he'd been lost too. I'll never forget that terrifying face, though. Even now, it haunts my dreams. Was he some deranged man hiding in the woods, or just a product of my fear? I'll never know. The memory of that unsettling experience still haunts me, especially when I'm alone at home. Whatever dark presence I encountered out there, I'm sure it's still hiding in those woods, waiting. I haven't ventured beyond my backyard since. Some nights, I still hear eerie cries echoing from the trees, and I just hope it never finds me again. Camping used to be one of my favorite family pastimes. Getting out into nature, cooking over a campfire, and telling stories under the stars. What's not to love? My wife, Sarah, and I took our son, Mike, camping as much as we could when he was growing up. But after what happened when he was 13, I don't think I'll ever enjoy camping the same way again. It was early November, ideal camping weather before it got too cold. We drove to one of our favorite spots, Cedar Grove State Park, on a Friday afternoon. Our campsite was in a more secluded part of the park, surrounded by tall pine trees. After setting up the tent and starting a fire, we cooked hot dogs for dinner. Mike was excited when the sun went down, and I told him some spooky stories about creatures in the forest. At that age, he found scary stories thrilling rather than terrifying. Afterward, we all went to bed, tired from the drive and setting up camp. That first night sleeping outdoors is always the best. So peaceful and quiet, wrapped up in the tent and completely exhausted. The next morning, we made pancakes over the fire for breakfast. As we ate, a park ranger stopped by to greet us. He was an older man with a wiry build and a big mustache. After some small talk, he reminded us to store all our food properly since bears had been active lately. We reassured him that we had a bear-proof container, which we always used when camping. Once the ranger left, we set out for a hike. Sarah is into bird watching, so she brought her binoculars and field guide to identify the birds we saw. Over the next few hours, we spotted kingfishers, robins, and finches. Mike complained a bit about being bored, but I could tell he was enjoying the hike too. Later in the afternoon, we returned to our campsite, where we played card games and read magazines. As dusk approached, I noticed a man at the campsite across the road. He kept glancing over at us more frequently as the evening wore on. He looked to be in his 40s, rough and scruffy. He was drinking beer and poking at his fire without much purpose. Something about the way he kept watching us made me uneasy. I decided to get Mike into the tent once it got dark so he'd be out of sight. Sarah and I stayed up by the fire until nearly midnight, talking and stargazing before turning in. Sometime later, I woke up to the sound of twigs snapping and leaves rustling outside the tent. I lay still, trying to make out the noises. Next to me, Sarah and Mike were still fast asleep. The crunching footsteps seemed to be right outside the tent wall. Adrenaline rushed through me as my mind raced to the worst-case scenarios. A wild animal, a deranged stranger, or the creepy camper from earlier. I carefully reached for my flashlight and switched it on, sweeping the beam around the inside of the tent. There was nothing inside, but the footsteps continued outside, definitely circling the tent. I took a deep breath and quietly unzipped the tent flap. Peeking out, I expected to see some wild animal, but instead, the light revealed the man from the neighboring campsite. He was crouching just a few feet away, his back facing me. Startled, I pointed the light directly at him. He turned around quickly, and for a moment we locked eyes. His face was illuminated by my flashlight, and there was a wild, glazed look in his eyes. Then, without warning, he snarled and lunged at me. I fell backward into the tent, shouting for Sarah and Mike to get out. The man scrambled to get into the tent, but Sarah was already awake, grabbing Mike and pushing him outside. I kicked wildly at the man, landing a hit on his face. He cried out in pain, and I managed to slip out of the tent. Outside, Sarah and Mike were already running toward the main campground. I grabbed my keys and a knife, slashing at the tent fabric as the man emerged, blood dripping from his mouth. He lunged at me again, but I dodged him and ran after my family. We shouted for help, and soon other campers emerged from their tents. I told them a man had attacked us and pointed to where he was, but by then, he was disappearing into the woods. The campground host called the police while checking to make sure we were okay. Paramedics arrived shortly after, followed by officers who took our statements. We decided not to stay another night and instead drove to a nearby hotel, where I barely slept. The next day, we headed home, exhausted and shaken. That feeling of safety I'd always had while camping was gone. This event took place when I was a teenager, so it's been more than 15 years now. I grew up in the Appalachian region, spending much of my childhood and teenage years outdoors, either camping or just enjoying nature in some way. For 2 summers in a row, I joined a group that would travel around backcountry roads to clean up trash. Mostly, it was picking up litter along the roadsides, but every now and then, the rangers would ask us to clear out trails or county roads where people had dumped garbage in the woods. On one particular day, our group had to split up to cover different sections. We were given GPS devices, but back then, their accuracy wasn't great, maybe within 100 meters if you were lucky. I didn't mind, though, because I dreamed of being a trail guide or working as a ranger someday. But some others weren't as comfortable with it, so they stayed closer to the main roads, leaving me to get dropped off at the end of a Forest Service road and make my way back to the meeting spot on foot. We each had a roll of garbage bags and a poking stick to pick up trash. The spot I was dropped off at was a known dumping ground. People would leave old furniture like couches, chairs, and sometimes even mattresses. However, someone with a truck had already come by to pick up the bigger items, leaving behind smaller things like bottles, cans, bags, and papers. Unfortunately, sometimes you'd find more disturbing things, like unwanted pets that had been cruelly abandoned. That day, I stumbled upon a litter of puppies that had met a sad end. I wasn't given a radio, but if I had one, I would have called for someone to come get me. They tried to keep us kids away from seeing anything too distressing. It wasn't the first time I'd encountered something like this, sadly. I gathered all the puppies into a bag, and instead of leaving them with the other trash I had collected, I decided to give them a proper burial. I left my backpack and poking stick by the road and walked into the woods, carrying the bag. After walking for about 20 minutes, I found a large pine tree that seemed like a good place for them to rest. I placed the bag at the base of the tree and started looking for something I could use to dig. I found a sturdy branch, broke it in half, and used my pocket knife to sharpen one end. After that, I went back to the tree and began digging a hole. Took a while as I had to work around several roots. Once the hole was about 1.5 feet deep, I laid the puppies to rest without the bag. I didn't want to add to the trash already out there. I took a moment to reflect, even tearing up a little. Seeing animals treated this way was always tough. As I was covering the grave, I suddenly heard a branch snap about 50 feet to my left. I stopped moving and just listened. The forest wasn't completely silent. There were still birds, but they were farther off, not near where the sound came from. After a few minutes of scanning the area, I didn't see anything, so I continued my task. Once I finished, I placed some pine cones and a nice rock on top of the grave. As I stood up to leave, I heard a low, moaning growl. This was bear territory, but there were also cougars around, so my first thought was that a predator had caught the scent of the puppies and come to investigate. All I had for protection was my pocket knife, but I wasn't too scared yet, thinking it could just be the sound of trees rubbing together in the wind. I looked around again, but didn't see anything. Just as I was about to continue walking, I saw a branch and some bark fall from a tree about 30 yards away. I looked up and noticed something midway up the tree. It was hard to describe. It was about the size of a bear cub, but had a grayish-brown, moss-like appearance. I couldn't tell what it was at first. I jumped back, cursing under my breath, and took a few steps away while keeping my eyes on it. I couldn't be sure if it was an animal or something else until it started moving. It was definitely alive, but it wasn't any creature I'd ever seen. It looked like living moss, but it moved like a raccoon, slowly making its way down the tree while watching me. The thing had 4 limbs that were wrapped around the tree, with claws as long as its fingers. Its tail was long and rat-like, swaying occasionally. The most unsettling thing was its face. It didn't have fur like a bear or a cougar. Its face was flat, almost squashed, and it had ears that resembled a human's more than an animal's. It didn't make a sound except for the scraping of its claws as it descended. It stopped on a branch about 12 feet off the ground and stared at me. Its eyes were lighter in color, catching the sunlight now and then. The whole thing seemed like it could camouflage itself into the tree or the forest floor. Suddenly, it let out a low-pitched whistle, and that's when I decided I had seen enough. I quickly checked behind me to make sure the path was clear and started running. I glanced back several times to make sure I wasn't being followed, but I didn't see it again. To this day, I still wonder what that creature was. I told the ranger in charge about what I'd seen, and he told me it was probably just a raccoon with mange. But the face didn't look anything like a raccoon to me. The closest comparison I could make would be to a snub-nosed monkey, but the size, color, and other features didn't match. There are no native monkey species here, and it didn't seem like an exotic pet either. I still don't know what I encountered that day,